Hello, I'm Celeste Kennel-Shank, Vice President of the Associated Church Press. I'm a bivocational pastor and journalist. I'm associate pastor of a Mennonite church in Chicago, and I have been on staff at Religion News Service, Sojourners, Mennonite World Review, and the Christian Century. After years of news briefs, deadline reporting, obits, full-length features, and editing books for other people, I'm working on a book project myself. I've plunged into the kind of deep research I haven't had time to do since working on my Master Divinity thesis. Fortunately, this project is interview-driven and not one in which I have to defend my academic work. My working title is Gathered and Scattered: The Life and Death of an Innovative Church. And my topic is the Community of Christ, an ecumenical congregation in Washington, D.C., which worshiped together from 1965 to 2016. The Community of Christ was intentionally planted in the inner city in 1965, a time when many churches were leaving. It attracted people disillusioned with religion. As one former member put it, the community distinguished itself from the more organized church without rejecting it. Members forged a close-knit community with Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals and Episcopalians, Mennonites and Methodists, forging a common life together and receiving communion each week around the same table. From its start, the Community of Christ strove to live out the principle that contemplation and social action do not need to be divided. It was also led primarily from the pews, or rather, folding chairs, with ordained pastors and priests playing a guiding role after the first 7 to 10 years together. Most of us have written or published enough headlines like "Church as usual is no longer an option" that we struggle to find something new to say. Stories of individual congregations trying out new ways of being together, different ways of being together, can be a way to move beyond statistics about decline in many of our denominations. Several authors I've worked with have written books about the first few years of a church they planted. A few examples are This is God's Table by Anna Woofenden, or We Were Spiritual Refugees by Katie Hayes. That kind of book inspired me to think there'd be value in detailing how an unusual model of church unfolded over the full course of its life. I've also heard from colleagues who are yearning for more examples of churches dying well. Part of my ministry is as a chaplain to people who are in the hospital or on hospice care, and I've seen the full gamut of being prepared or unprepared for the end of a person's life. I've seen how dying well flows from living well. As it is with people, so it is with churches. The Community of Christ lived well for 51 years. When members ceased worshiping together in 2016, they transferred the building in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Washington, D.C. to a partner in mission, a healthcare service provider called La Clínica del Pueblo. Above the front door, the sign still says La Casa, a name that has stuck from its time as a restaurant through its 4 decades as a worship and public gathering space, now to a health and action center. When I'm visiting my hometown of DC and my home neighborhood of Mount Pleasant, and I walk by the building, I see posters promoting education and support services for Spanish-speaking immigrant women and LGBTQ people, and I feel resurrection power. The Community of Christ is the congregation where I was raised, formed, and baptized at the age of 17. Being an ecumenical community, the Community of Christ practiced both infant baptism and baptism upon confession of faith, the latter being what I and my Mennonite parents held as our ritual. People at the community had been talking for several years, including at our 50th anniversary reunion and final retreat in 2016, about having a history of the community. I've been honored by being entrusted by others to take on this task. So as I begin my research, I've started by placing the Community of Christ in the context during the era in which it was planted. So I've been reading the books that the early leaders were reading. One being The Congregation and Mission by George Weber. Another, A Public and Private Faith by William Stringfellow. And thirdly, The Secular City by Harvey Cox. I'm also researching congregations around North America that were peers in some way. A primary among them, in many ways, is the Church of the Savior, which is familiar to some of you, I imagine. And it has ministries in DC neighborhoods where the Community of Christ was located, as well as those adjacent. It's older than the Community of Christ was, started in the 1940s, and it was a big influence on the Community of Christ, especially in its early years. And we continued to serve alongside the Church of the Savior in its ministries, such as at Christ House in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of DC throughout many years, including the years that my family was part of the community. There was another church called the Community of Christ the Servant in Lombard, Illinois, close to where I live now. The name appears to be unrelated, but it was also a Lutheran-connected congregation that had some similarities. So those are just two examples of the kind of church I'm looking for more examples of. And that's where I'd be very open to hearing from any of you in the ACP, RCC, or the CCCA, if you know of any congregations across North America. So I'm looking for ones that meet at least some or most of these criteria. So politically active, predominantly lay-led, beginning in the late 50s, the 1960s, or the 1970s. These may be congregations that didn't meet in a traditional sanctuary, or they may have had unusual characteristics in their worship style of life together that set them apart from other congregations. These congregations could still be meeting, or they could have closed somewhere along the way. I'm not necessarily looking for success stories so much as other examples of this sort of life and death of a congregation, or life and continuing life of a congregation. I'm also open to congregations of any faith. They don't have to be Christian. The Community of Christ, as I mentioned, started in 1965, and that was a period of a lot of tension in the church. And many of you are familiar with that, either having lived through it or researched it. At that time, many majority white Protestant congregations had moved to the suburbs, and new churches, Catholic as well as Protestant, were often started in the suburbs, and many inner city congregations struggled. Yet there were Protestant seminarians and pastors across the US. Historian Mark Wild calls them the renewalist movement, who recommitted themselves to the city after World War II. So the Community of Christ began in that second generation of renewal. So that's the period that I'm looking at most specifically. Someone I talk a lot about in the book so far, and in the final manuscript, was named Dora Kundakjan Johnson. She immigrated to the United States in the late 1950s from Lebanon, where she was raised in an Armenian family. She was one of the early members of the Community of Christ, and she was one of the central lay leaders, and she remained so until her death in 2012. Dora was there for the major growth points and events in the community's life, when it became more fully ecumenical with both Catholics and Protestants sharing the Eucharist, when the founding pastor left for a new opportunity after 7 years, and when the community decided in the mid-1970s to try what was initially going to be a year-long experiment of having its Sunday services be led by lay people taking turns in a rotation. That ended up continuing for the rest of its life as a worshiping body. Even as it was lay-led, the ordained or theologically trained people celebrated the Eucharist at the community. And at a moment when members realized that all of those theologically trained people were men, they created a process for 2 women to become Eucharistic ministers, and that continued for the last decade or so of the community. As I started digging into this project, I realized I'd need to free up time from looking for freelance assignments, and I applied for a grant from the Louisville Institute. I was very fortunate and blessed to be among the 30 North American pastoral leaders who received a Pastoral Study Project grant for 18 months this year and into next year. The Louisville Institute defines pastoral leader generously, so I would encourage all of you, if this might be something that could bolster a project that you might want to work on, to look into the grants that are available from the Louisville Institute, whether that's as a pastoral leader, or whether that is a project grant or a sabbatical grant for researchers, a first book grant for scholars of color, and they also have doctoral, dissertation, and postdoctoral fellowships. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the Louisville Institute website. I'll share that link at the end of this presentation. They'll release updated information about the next cycle of grants on May 1st. So you can begin looking on the website now, but you'll want to be sure to go and get the updated information on May 1st or later. And then the deadlines begin with September 1st for the Pastoral Study Project grant. And then after that, October 1st, December 1st, and so forth for the other grants and fellowships. I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to join me today and to hear a bit more about my project. I welcome any feedback that any of you have, as well as any way that I can be of service to you as you work on your own projects. I'm going to share some information now with you. Here we go. Okay. So here I'll snap to that screen. If you're interested in updates about this book project, please subscribe to my newsletter. It's on Substack. So it's my name, celestekennel-shank.substack.com. And I only send it once every 5 weeks or so it won't fill your inbox. And here is my contact information. You can reach me at celeste.kennel-shank@gmail.com, or you can reach out to anyone at the ACP and they can put you in touch with me. If you'd like to learn more about grants from the Louisville Institute, the website is https://Louisville is spelled LOUISVILLE, and then it's -institute.org. Thanks again for taking some time to spend with me and learn more about this project.